In 1937, as World War II was on the eve of erupting, Jean Renoir released a film that was simultaneously an indictment of war as well as a lamentation of the end of a world that was in a way more honorable, chivalrous, and gentlemanly. Hello, I'm Peter Garrett, and this is the Criterion Chronicle. Welcome to the Criterion Chronicle. I'm your host, Peter Garrett, and the Criterion Chronicle is the chronological journey through the Criterion Collection, starting from DVD spine number 1. Now, we begin our journey with the one that started it all for Criterion in the DVD era, the classic French war film Grand Illusion, directed by Jean Renoir. Now, Grand Illusion is about two French pilots played by Jean Gabin and Pierre Freinet, who are shot down during World War I, captured, and put into multiple POW camps as they keep trying to escape. Now, World War I films, in my opinion, tend to be an underserved genre of war film. You know, and there's some great World War I genre, World War I films. There's Wings, there's All Quiet on the Western Front, there's Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory, there's Sam Mendes' 1917, but they're few and far between. You don't see them that often, and there's plenty of World War II films. And now I think the reason that they are less prevalent is due to the fact that the war was more morally ambiguous. I think that especially to World War II. World War II had a very clear, villain, as it were, a clear opposing force with the Nazis, and so whereas World War I was this war between European nations that kind of snowballed when all of these alliances just kind of all came together and all this military technology. So I think, though, that because it's not as clear cut as World War II, it didn't offer as much of, say, dramatic stakes as, say, World War I did. So, and I don't know. There were just no clear hostile forces attempting to conquer countries, like the way that the Nazis did in Europe and the way that the Japanese did in the Pacific. Battles and missions in World War I were just less impressive. They were less cinematic, as it were, as opposed to World War II, because World War I was just mainly a trench war. So, and in World War II, you had these, incredible stories and these incredible situations. You had the evacuation of Dunkirk, which was portrayed in movies like Atonement and Dunkirk. You had the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was in, From Here to Eternity and Tora, 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 and of course, the eponymous Pearl Harbor, and of course D-Day, which was in the film The Longest Day and the opening of Saving Private Ryan. So the films of World War II, just, again, the narrative structure of how World War II is, just, I think, lended itself better to film overall. And then because again, after World War I, World War II after World War II, I should say, basically it just kind of exploded, obviously, and that was the main thing. So, but I've always found World War I fascinating because I think it had a more profound effect on the world than people realize. World War I was the first modern war. It was the first that featured the uses of such weapons as tanks, airplanes, artillery, the first large-scale use of chemical warfare. And the war also significantly changed the world geographically and politically. You had the end of multiple massive empires. You had the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and was a major factor in the beginning of the decline of the British Empire. So, and also, World War I laid the foundation, the groundwork for the rise of fascism and Nazism in Europe, culminating in World War II. So in my opinion, World War I actually, to me, had a more profound effect on the world. And I feel like because films didn't, especially now, films don't, I think, truly respect that history of World War I. So, and Grand Illusion was actually, when it came out, it had such a strong effect that the Nazis actually banned the film due to its anti-war, anti-nationalist message. So, I think that makes it, again, a more fascinating film because the film is very pro-humanist in a lot of ways. Grand Illusion belongs to a specific subgenre of the war film. Grand Illusion is one of the masterpieces of the prisoners of war genre. It's considered one of the earliest films in the genre to use the setting of the POW camp to examine the psychological impact of the war. The film, it focuses mainly on the characters and the characters' experiences in this, in these prisoner of war camps. And, with Jean Gabin's Marechal and Pierre Frenet's de Bolduc as the main characters that we follow, and they're two men from different classes. So prior films had a more standard narrative in the World War I genre. The soldiers, planning and executing an escape with the camps merely as kind of the setting. And that's pretty much what prisoner of war camps in general tend to be. They tend to be based mainly on escape or some sort of mission to liberate, to free the prisoners. So, but what, in my opinion, what differentiates prisoner of war films from traditional war films is there is usually very little combat or battle scenes. So in Grand Illusion, for instance, it begins with Jean Gabin's Marechal and Pierre Frenet's Captain Bolduc doing a reconnaissance flight and then cutting immediately to the capture by the Germans. So we don't see the planes. We don't see, any sort of action shot going into this. It's just they are together. We see, Gabin basically getting called in. He meets de Bolduc. He's being told, okay, this is what, you have a mission. We need to take some photos and this is what you have to do. And, the characters meet. So, but we don't see anything. It just cuts from them leaving on the mission straight to after they've been captured. Now, granted, an interesting thing, the reason why there are no plane sequences in the film is because the producers couldn't get the planes for it, which, I think is, again, that's understandable. But that's also what makes that brilliant filmmaking is that it's using limitations in a way to your advantage. So do we need to see the reconnaissance flight? No, probably not. It's not really necessary to be able to understand the stakes, or it would probably be nice to be able to see them, but we don't necessarily have to see it. We know what it is, we know what's going to be happening, and then we see what the after effects are for it. But anyway, that's really the only kind of combat or war traditional war related scene that actually happens, and we don't even get to see it. So because the primary settings for Grand Illusion are the two different prison camps that are a majority of the film. So the first is the more traditional Halbach camp, where and the second one is the more ominous Wintersborn fortress that is where we where the main escape attempt tends to happen. So now the way that this film also differentiates, this film also differentiates itself from other POW films. In a typical POW film, the prisoners live in dirty and cramped and often miserable conditions. That's something that we get used to seeing in, again, most World War II prisoner of war camps. Is their living conditions are terrible. But in Grand Illusion, the prisoners enjoy this quite comfortable existence. They're able to receive parcels and mail. food and alcohol and presents and clothes. They're able to have these big kind of pleasant, lavish dinners with each other, almost as if, that, something that where they can actually have full meals. They're not just getting, you know, just like soup or, a potato in like a tin, on a tin tray. There's more, they live in more, comfortable accommodations. I mean, there's still multiple men in a room, but, the beds are spread out and there's actually room for them to have, it's almost more like a barracks, as opposed to, say, stacked beds that, you would see in other prisoner of war films. So it's interesting. And I as far as I know, there was a good amount of verisimilitude in the movie portraying this stuff. It's not like it was Hollywood up, as it were, to make it look better than it was. I think that because Renoir was actually fought in World War I, he had a knowledge of the conflict and the experience firsthand that he was able to apply to the film. So now granted, the film does do a lot of interesting things, and it does do a lot of, and it does do different things than the genre typically has, but that's not to say that the film doesn't indulge in a few genre conventions. So, a common trope that you see in multiple prisoner of war films there's a moment when the prisoners put on some sort of a stage show, whether that's like a sketch or whether that's a musical number, and Grand Illusion is no different. It's a big kind of, vaudeville type show. It goes further than just being a regular thing. That we actually, we actually see the show in terms of from its beginning stages where they're rehearsing, and we see them being supplied with costumes and all this stuff. It almost for a little bit, it almost turns into a different kind of film at that moment, because we almost forget that they're in a prison camp. It turns almost into like a theatrical based musical in a way. So because it starts with the backstage rehearsals and then goes to the final performance. And then another, and this is obviously probably the most common trope of the POW genre, are the escape attempts. So, and escape attempts feature, maybe not super prominently, but they're there enough. In the first, in the first Camp Halbach, the escape attempt is a much lesser plot point than it is when they get to Wintersborn Fortress. So, and the second one actually, with the second one being successful, it sets up the final act, the final part of the film, when Marischal and Rosenthal are trying to make their way to Switzerland, and they end up at the farm and meet Ilsa and her daughter. So in the first part of it at Halbach, we watch the French, again, just like in other films, we're watching the French prisoners working on the escape tunnel, disposing of the excess dirt in the garden, either through their clothing or through other means, which virtually mirrors other later POW films like The Great Escape. But again, there's the section in that film, the escape section in the first camp in Halbach doesn't actually last very long, because the human element and the human stories get in the way. So, or I don't say get in the way, but they interrupt it. So the escape attempt at Halbach almost becomes an afterthought, whereas the escape from Wintersborn becomes the main, a much more prominent section, and it's actually the most action-oriented part of the film. So, but I think the reason why the escapes are not the main, I think that the escapes don't serve as the main purpose of the story. They drive the action, they drive the story, but they're not the main purpose of the story. They serve as more incidental aspects of life in captivity for the soldiers, almost as if it's assumed escape attempts will always be tried. Because they say that a soldier's first duty from capture is, is escape. So I think that, and again, for instance, in the first camp, we only see the digging of of a tunnel once, and that's it. We don't see any other attempts or any other going back. It's not a recurring element in the story, in that part of the story. So I think Renoir was more interested in the life of the characters in the camps and their relationships to each other, as opposed to the story solely focusing on escaping. Now, another thing that prisoner of war films often focus on more are the psychological and the philosophical elements of war, as opposed to the visceral violence and destruction. Because the action rarely leaves the confines of their confinement. More scenes can focus on the characters' thoughts and feelings regarding their situation and war itself. At the time, Grand Illusion came out, arguably the most famous and successful war film had been Lewis Milestone's All Quiet on the Western Front. All Quiet on the Western Front worked as a conventional war film, relying on large-scale battle scenes to convey the horrors of war. But Grand Illusion takes a completely different approach, using character introspection and revelation to make its point. So Grand Illusion's core thesis doesn't center on the nature or futility of war, but on a different thematic element entirely. Now, probably the most prevalent theme in Grand Illusion is that of European class and aristocracy. So Maréchal and de Bolduc represent the proletariat and patrician classes of Europe at the time, and it creates this clear disconnect between the characters. We see them interact with each other, but obviously Maréchal and de Bolduc carry themselves very differently. They share a French nationality, but that seems less consequential in the beginning. When they meet each other, there's this formality, which you can argue is part of the fact that that he's a captain and Maréchal's a lieutenant, so maybe there's the chain of command, but there isn't this kind of shared identity with each other as both being Frenchmen. De Bolduc, expects to be treated with a courtesy, and respect, and this goes all the way even into when he's in the prison camps. So we see de Bolduc actually bond better with the head of Wintersborn, which is von Rauffenstein, who's played by German director Erich von Stroheim. And the reason that they connect better is because they are both from aristocratic backgrounds. So multiple times throughout the film, the two characters speak to each other, in English, which language is used, which I'll talk about a little later. Language is used in a way very deliberately in the film, which I believe is meant to distinguish them from every other character. It's the only time English is ever spoken in the film. Most of the film is in French with a little bit in German, but the scenes between de Bolduc and von Rauffenstein tend to have the strongest effect thematically in the film. And I think, and in particular, I think the most poignant scene in the whole film is when de Bolduc visits von Rauffenstein, and the two lament the fact that their aristocratic existence is on the verge of extinction. And they have this conversation with each other where they are talking about the changing world and the idea that the gentlemanly nature of war at that point is pretty much dying. So, but the key difference between them is that de Bolduc is essentially, he accepts his fate. He accepts these changes that are happening, and he's more forward thinking than von Rauffenstein. So de Bolduc understands that times change and nothing can be done about it. So he has this kind of calm resignation that his time is over, which I think ultimately leads into his decision later on in the film. So, and de Bolduc doesn't see himself as, even though he in the beginning, when he's at Halbach, he demands respect, and wants to be treated. But I think that that's not so much. I don't know if that's as much in relation to his class as much as just at the time in this world, treating people, even prisoners of war, disrespectfully or harshly was probably looked at as, again, ungentlemanly, undignified. So, because by the time de Bolduc gets to Wintersborn, he doesn't mind being in with the more working class characters like Marischal and some of the other soldiers and Rosenthal that he interacts with. And there's actually moments when there's a scene where the German guards are searching and doing kind of a head check in the room, and von Rauffenstein goes over to de Bolduc to talk to him and kind of commiserate with him privately, and you see him signaling his disdain in a way for these working class people. So whereas de Bolduc doesn't have that same kind of prejudice in him. So, de Bolduc in a way is kind of that archetype of a more progressive aristocrat. And he understanding that his place in the world is changing. So, and again, I think that's what makes a film like Grand Illusion so interesting, because it doesn't play into the dynamics that we expect from a film like this. Because in prisoner of war films set during World War II, there's typically a very clear hostile and adversarial dynamic between, the head of the camp, their guards, and the prisoners. So, we see that clear distinction in World War II, which, probably makes for a much easier film to process, because we know who the good guys are, and we know who the bad guys are. But whereas in a film like Grand Illusion, it's, it gets a little grayer, because even the guards in Grand Illusion are not these sadistic animals. They're not torturing the prisoners. They're not doing things to them. There's not this glee in being hostile and vicious to them like we might see in, say, a World War II prisoner of war film, or even going further than that to like Vietnam era type prisoner of war films. So, and I think that that's what makes Grand Illusion so unique, is because it subverts that common narrative. We actually see guards and prisoners having civil conversations with each other. And I think, and even though von Rauffenstein does have his character flaws, obviously his prejudices and stuff like that, he's not your standard POW film antagonist. So, as I said, he's played by German film director Erich von Stroheim, who, did some acting, but obviously he was more well known as a director. And what in his first scene already sets him apart. In his very first scene, after shooting their plane down, he says to his men to find out if the pilots he shot down were officers, and if they were, to invite them to lunch, which already signifies that this man is more cultured, and this man has more respect and courtesy towards his fellow soldier, even if they're on opposing sides, than simply just, they're French, I'm German, so they're our enemy, and we're going to treat them poorly no matter what. Because, once he meets Marischal and de Bolduc, he's very courteous, he's very respectful. Again, they sit down and they have a nice, lunch with each other, and they have again, you wouldn't assume that these people were enemies to each other watching the scene. And I think it's due to von Rauffenstein's sense of honor and chivalry that he cannot treat these officers in a degraded manner. So I think that that's what his station prevents him from doing. So, and I think the ultimate metaphor of the film culminates during the escape at Wintersborn. So during this escape, when Marischal and Rosenthal, they create this they come up with this elaborate diversion where they're going to first play these flutes or recorders or some sort of, wind instrument to create a a disturbance, and then it moves to them banging on pots and other things to create an even louder diversion. But the final act is done by Duboldu himself when he decides to basically take the guards on this chase around the fortress. So because they realize that when all the guards are distracted and chasing after something, that it would allow for an escape attempt to occur. So Duboldu ends up, he's running around getting chased, which allows for Marischal and Rosenthal to use their makeshift rope to get out and be able to escape. But Duboldu doesn't just end with him, but the diversion doesn't just end with him basically just taking them on a chase. It ends with Duboldu actually, sacrificing himself in a way that kind of serves as a final acceptance that his time as part of the pinnacle of society is over. So because as during the escape attempt, he ends up getting shot and then ultimately dying of the wound. So, and I think Duboldu's decision has the strongest effect on von Rauffenstein, who is the one who is forced to shoot him. So up until this point, when they've connected to each other, we're meant to believe that the strongest connection in the film is between Duboldu and von Rauffenstein. The scenes, the philosophical discussions, the speaking in English to each other, it's a connection that only these two characters have. So to see von Rauffenstein having to resort to having to shoot Duboldu is this kind of ultimate severing of that tie. And as Duboldu is dying in bed, he expresses that for a common man, so for a working man to die in war, it's tragic. But for someone like him, it's a good death. For an aristocrat to die this honorable death, it's good. And I think that that's, to me, that kind of typifies I want to say it typifies the whole essence of the difference in class, because someone like Marischal is there because he's fighting for his country and that's what he's expected to do and that's what he's going to do. Whereas an aristocrat, it's looked at more as, this is your duty. This is, it's not even you're conscripted. This is what you have to volunteer for this. Otherwise you're a coward. So I think that, Duboldu serves as this ultimate dignified character who understands and isn't naive about the world. And at the core of the film, at the core of the film is this idea that time is moving on, that the world is changing, and that these characters like Duboldu and von Rauffenstein are on the way out. So, it is kind of tragic for him. So, but then also at the core of the film's exploration of class and nature is the film's central actor and the main performance. Now, the main character is played by Jean Gabin, and Jean Gabin is considered one of the greatest French film stars of all time. He was at his peak, he was considered on par with Humphrey Bogart or James Cagney. And granted, now the film boasts a terrific cast. Gabin is, to me, the clear standout of the movie. He puts in the best performance, and I think that he carries a lot of the thematic weight on his shoulders. I mean, Freinet does a wonderful job as Duboldu, and I think it's a great complimentary performance. But I think Gabin has the more interesting, has the more interesting character. And when Gabin starred in Grand Illusion, he was arguably at the peak of his fame. So, and Gabin's performance as Marischal is superb. I mean, he's got this true movie star charisma where you're just hanging on his performance at every turn. Right from the start. Marischal, he's charming and he's likable. We see him listening to a phonograph, singing along to a record, and then talking casually about meeting up with a woman that he's gonna go on a date with. So he's very relatable, and he's made to be the audience is made to connect with him right off the bat. And which I think serves as the compared to Duboldu, who's his character's very formal and stoic and much different. So we kind of feel more disassociated from Duboldu as a character, I think, as we do from Marischal. And Marischal he has a much bigger emotional range as a character compared to Duboldu and von Rauffenstein. So, and I believe the reason is because I think this further explores the differences between a working class character and the aristocratic characters. We see Marischal vividly express moments of levity, despair, anger, genuine warmth. He's got a lot of great moments and levels to his performance. Now we compare that to both Duboldu and von Rauffenstein, and I believe whose high class background demands that their behavior is rooted in discipline and dignity, and not prone to any kind of emotionality in any kind of way that, say, Marischal's character does. Both characters tend to maintain this kind of calm demeanor, this more stoic, reserved character. So whereas Marischal is a lot more dynamic, and he's a lot more unpredictable, and he's a lot potentially more volatile in scenes. So he has more moments that we can identify with, as well as a humility about his modest place in life. So in the beginning, when they're first captured and they have their lunch with von Rauffenstein, he's talking to a German soldier who speaks French, and they connect with the fact that they're both mechanics, and that the German mechanic actually lived and worked in France. So and then later on there's a moment where when he's at the farm, that he has this kind of almost sweet interaction with a cow, where he's talking to them about how he's comparing himself to this cow's existence. So, which again is a great little moment between the two of them. And again, it shows Marischal has this. Again, he's a much more relatable character. So, and he serves as, again, the foil for, or as the audience, as who we are as the audience, because there's usually that one character that is the one that we connect with the most, and that's Marischal. And Marischal, because Marischal is the representative of the everyman. He is the everyman that is going to supplant the aristocrat in European society. Even with the way he carries himself in the movie, he's more relaxed, he's more at ease. He doesn't have the social pressures of maintaining a certain decorum that, say, Duboldu has or von Rauffenstein has. He can be silly, he can be goofy at times. He can be undignified, he can be unshaven. There's moments. So we see him in a much more realistic portrayal. So and it's what's also interesting is we get to see him in a domestic setting. We get to see Marischal after Marischal and Rosenthal have escaped from Wintersborn and have been traveling. they end up taking shelter in a farm that is, that is lived in by a German widow named Elsa and her daughter. And we get to see a different side to the character. So there's only one woman in the entire film, and that's Elsa. If you don't count the daughter, but I'll call it an adult, an adult, female character. And she's played by Dita Parlo, who is, wonderful actress. She's not in the film for long, but her character is incredibly important and incredibly impactful. She's actually second credited after Jean Gabin in the opening credits, which is interesting because she's only in the film for maybe like 10 or 15 minutes. So, but what I love about those scenes is the fact that, again, up until this, we've seen the characters interacting in the prison camps. We've seen them interacting with other soldiers, with guards. So getting this final sequence in a more household kind of family environment with Marichal, say, as the father, Elsa as the mother, her daughter, Lottie as obviously the daughter, and then Rosenthal as maybe this, uncle, as it were. And it's a wonderful little sequence because it to me, it acts almost as this kind of sweet antidote to the rest of the film, where the rest of the film is about, being, is about being in this, being prisoners of war and dealing with life in captivity and war itself and all these heavier themes. And then we get this domestic scene, or this domestic part of the film, where it to me, which really humanizes the film. For instance, there's a great sequence that takes place with Christmas, where they have a Jesus's birth, the nativity sequence, a nativity setup in the house, and there's a sweet moment where the baby Jesus is picked up by the daughter Lottie, and she says that she wants to keep him, and she says that she wants to keep him because she wants to eat him, because the baby Jesus in the film is made out of, I think, of a potato. So, but seeing Marichal's interactions with this little girl gives the character this sweetness and this tenderness that we didn't get to see in the rest of the film. So, and to me, that's another thing that differentiates this film, this prisoner of war film specifically, because typically in a prisoner of war film, once the characters get out, that's the end of the movie. They've escaped. Or once the rescue happens. Whereas in this, the escape happens, but that's not the end of the film. That just lays the groundwork for the very final part, which is the sequence at the farm. And the sequence at the farm ends in this heartbreaking way where Jean Gabin has, where Marichal and Rosenthal have to leave, and they're discussing it with each other, and Rosenthal basically says, "Have you told her?" And he says, "Not yet." And there's this kind of, this heartbreaking and sad goodbye between, Marichal and Elsa. So because we've learned that, in the sequence, we learned that Elsa's husband was also a soldier and he died, was killed in combat. And so we see Marichal almost kind of taking that role as the husband, as the father of this home. And Elsa even says that it was, nice that he made it feel that way again. So Jean Gabin gives an incredible performance. I think this is one of his best films as an actor. He has other films in the Criterion Collection as well. He has Pepe Le Moco. He has La Bête Humaine. He worked with Jean Renoir again in a movie called French Can-Can. So, But I think this is probably his. This is one of my favorite films of his. So now, and while Gabin was the dominant force in front of the camera, the other side was just as masterfully executed. Jean Renoir was considered one of the greatest, is considered one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. He's definitely considered probably in the top 5 of greatest French filmmakers of all time. So, and Renoir, as the name suggests, was the son of the famed French impressionist painter Pierre Auguste Renoir. So it makes you wonder, is artistic ability genetic? And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe living in that kind of an environment does have an effect on creative ability. But I'm not quite sure. So his films, though, but Renoir's films have influenced countless other filmmakers including Francois Truffaut, Martin Scorsese, Robert Altman, Peter Bogdanovich, and Mike Leigh. There's a British film critic named David Thompson that said Renoir was the model of humanist cinema, which to me rang completely true because Grand Illusion is a humanist work. And Grand Illusion is one of his masterworks that proves his humanist eye as a filmmaker. Renoir believed that the film was about human relationships. So, which is a core of the entire film. The entire film are these relationships, whether that's the relationship between de Baldoux and von Raufenstein, whether that's the relationship between Marischal and Rosenthal, whether that's the relationship between Marischal and Elsa. So, and they all have their purposes. So, and not only did Renoir direct the film, but he also co-wrote the film with Charles Spock. So, as I said, the film. So Renoir was in World War II. He was a pilot in World War I. Sorry, he was a pilot in World War I, and he actually based the film on a pilot he met and he knew during World War I, and his experiences getting shot down, getting sent to prison camps, and escaping from those camps. The pilot that he based this on actually had been imprisoned in 7 camps and escaped 7 times, which is incredible. But yeah. So obviously, his real life experiences informed the story and the filmmaking. So, and it even went so far as that that the uniform that Gabin wears in the beginning was Renoir's actual uniform from the war. So, which I was thinking that was really interesting that he was able to bring that. I mean, you can't get more realistic than that in the film. And Renoir's intention with the film, and this is according to film scholar Peter Cowie, who does the film commentary on the DVD, he wanted to show his dream of a peaceful world. He wanted to, showing soldiers from different countries getting along. He believed that people from different backgrounds had more in common with each other than they realized. And this shows up multiple times in the film. This is evidenced in the lunch scene, again, where Marischal meets, when the person he's sitting next to, he finds out is also a mechanic who, lived in Lyon, and culminates with or it doesn't culminate, but the German soldier actually, because Gabin is injured and his arm is in a sling after being shot down, the German soldier actually offers to cut his food for him. I mean, which is obviously a very considerate and gracious gesture on your captor's part. So, and and Renoir himself actually referred to World War I as a gentleman's war. So, however, he wasn't attempting to excuse it or romanticize it. Obviously the film itself being anti-war, mainly because war itself is anti-human. So, but Renoir, wanted to make a film that showed soldiers in a prison camp instead of in the trenches, because he was more interested in showing, and this is in his own words, the common humanity of man. So really, I mean, I know that Grand Illusion wasn't the first prisoner of war film that ever came out. There were ones that had come out before that, but I think that Grand Illusion is considered the the pioneering film of a lot of common war, prisoner of war film tropes. One of them being the philosophy and of examining characters in these experiences. So, what's interesting is, because of that, some critics at the time actually accused Renoir of making the film too cheerful. Because because they made it, they claim that he was making the life in the prison seem fun and enjoyable, which, you can maybe you can make a case for it, because there are moments of levity. The characters don't seem downtrodden. They don't seem in despair or feeling as if there's no hope. And again, going back to the vaudeville scene, I mean, there are all these moments where it looks like they are having fun. And during the performance itself, there's a lot of just merriment, and it almost looks like, almost like a vacation to an extent, the way it's portrayed. So, but and the thing is and Renoir was and I haven't spoken a lot about his, the technical elements of the film, because in the film he wasn't, Renoir wasn't as focused on, certain technical things as he was just the story and the performances and the relationships. So, but as far as shooting the film was concerned, Renoir preferred fewer cuts, and he wanted the camera to be more mobile and showing, so there were many sequences of the film where the camera moves to show multiple characters in a scene. So this happens in the first dinner scene that we have at Halbach, when we see Marischal meeting Rosenthal and all the other prisoners in that. There's a sequence during the show when Gabin's Marischal interrupts to say that the French have retaken a fort that the Germans had captured, and so as a way to celebrate, they stop the performance and they start singing La Marseillaise, and the camera moves very dynamically, not only showing the French soldiers singing, but it also shows the German guards reacting to the French singing. So, and then also when the Germans are doing their barracks check at Wintersborn, we see the camera moving from bunk to bunk. So yeah, and that's one of the things that I appreciate about a lot, about older films, is older films didn't rely on fast cutting nearly as much as films do today. So they let the films breathe. They let the audience take in what they're watching and really absorb the imagery. And so, because I also think that, it takes more effort staging. When you have to stage 20 or 30 actors on a set, and with the camera moving, and everybody has their different actions and their lines, it probably gets, more, it can get more complicated from a directing standpoint than just, doing quicker cuts and not having to worry as much about, filming a 20-second sequence, a 30-second sequence or longer uncut. So, and again, Renoir he admitted he wasn't as concerned with utilizing revolutionary techniques with the film. So that the human story was the most important thing, and that's what he wanted to do, because the film, again, the film itself it's about people. It's not about war, and um, and that's another thing that I think sets it apart from many other war films, especially World War II films, because World War II films, again, they're very clear good guy, bad guy stories. Usually, it's we're seeing the Allies fighting the Axis powers, and we know who the good guys are, we know who the bad guys are, and we know what the missions are, we know what the objectives are. But in World War I, this, again, because it's different, Grand Illusion tells a story that doesn't, and it doesn't, and again, it doesn't really vilify the Germans that much. They're there and they're guards, but but the one thing that he did do that was unique was having that, I guess, had not been done very often at the time, and probably afterwards hadn't been done very much, was he had the characters from different nationalities speaking their native languages, which was extremely rare for a film in 1937. So the French characters spoke French, the German characters spoke German, the Russian characters spoke Russian. So there's never moments there. So there, for instance, there's even a moment when Marischal attempts to tell an incoming POW to Halbach about the tunnel that they've been building, and the character is British, but he can't. And we see Marischal speaking to him in French, and the character responds to him in English saying, "I'm sorry, I don't understand you." So, which again is a small thing, but I think what it does is it adds so much realism and again, verisimilitude, than having all the characters speaking the same language, but being from different countries. So obviously that, when that's done because it's meant to it's meant to make it easier for the audience to follow. But because these characters are speaking different languages, it makes it so, again, that's how it would be in real life. So when Jean Gabin's talking to, again, the German soldier in the beginning, the German soldier is speaking to him in French, it's not like they can understand each other in different languages. But ultimately, Jean Renoir, he created an enduring film, and it's a film that still resonates with audiences almost 90 years later. So my final thoughts, we'll start with this. Now, one thing I decided to not discuss was the title itself, Grand Illusion. And the reason I chose not to do that is because I believe that the film's title has multiple interpretations. So when I was listening to the audio commentary by Peter Cowie, he was mentioning throughout the film that this is another grand illusion, this is another grand illusion, this is another grand illusion. And so for me, I don't want to sit here and tell you what I think the core grand illusion of the film is. I think that I suggest that you watch the film or you rewatch the film and you decide what the title means. Because that's what art is. Art is interpretation. And interpretation to me is not one thing. Some films, some people want to think that a film predominantly means one thing, or that a lot of films might. But Grand Illusion is such a rich film, and Grand Illusion has so many different levels that it plays with the characters and circumstances that, I mean, it's one of the things that to me a truly great film does is gets better, and you find something different with each rewatch, and Grand Illusion is one of those films. So now there are two main reasons I enjoy Grand Illusion so much. So the first is because of my strong fascination and interest in World War I, which again, I think is greatly underserved uh, as a film genre. And I would love to see more World War One films uh, do that. So, I enjoy and again, I know it's difficult because World War One wasn't as there were things about it that weren't as interesting. It didn't have as big of a canvas, as it were. It took place mainly in Europe. Um, and the battles, the trench warfare was just were just back and forth, and there wasn't a lot happening compared to the types of battles in World War II. But I still think that, again, I love World War One films. And again, I hope to see more of them. And I also, and I enjoy seeing films that explore because I enjoy seeing I enjoy seeing films that explore this conflict that I feel not as many people know about. And and again, as a Grand Illusion examines things like social class and human connection in a way that World War II films don't, and even other war films tend to miss. So, and as I said earlier in my introduction, I would argue that World War One changed the world much more dramatically than World War II did. So, so that's the first reason, is just World War One in general as a genre is what one of the reasons I love the film. The second reason that I really enjoy, that I love the movie, is because it is how it subverts the genre of a prisoner of war films. So, and don't get me wrong, I love prisoner of war films. I love the genre. The Bridge on the River Kwai, The Great Escape, those are excellent, fantastic films. And I find those films more enjoyable and entertaining to watch. But they follow that more traditional, but those are both World War II movies, and they both follow the traditional, Great Escape is obviously an objective film where the entire objective is escaping from this prison camp. And The Bridge on the River Kwai is a mission film. It's actually a 2-mission film where it's Colonel Nicholson's character is first a battle of wills between him and Colonel Saito about how to be treated in the prisoner camp, and then eventually him building the bridge, and then William Holden's Major Shear's character being anyway. But Grand Illusion is a unique and beautiful film that sets out to truly explore that which connects us together. So, and I think Grand Illusion offers a refreshing take on the genre without leaning into the cliche or the sentimentality of what it's trying to say. So on that, now, as far as how you can watch Grand Illusion, unfortunately, the Criterion DVD has been out of print for some time. Unfortunately, I meant to bring my DVD with me to show you, but I forgot it, so I apologize. I will definitely make sure to remember bringing the DVDs next time. But I'll have a visual representation to show what the DVD looks like. But if you want to acquire the DVD, you can. You can find previously owned copies on eBay starting for around $40. And new and sealed copies, because I personally, when I buy a DVD, I don't like to buy it used. I like to buy it new. The sealed copy started around $65. So now, as far as this recording, because I'm recording this probably a little bit before when this is going to be posted, it's not currently streaming on the Criterion channel. I know it's been on the Criterion channel before, but as far as right now, I don't think it's on there. I also read that it can be found on a streaming service called Canopy with a K. So now, if by the time this episode is released and there's a change, please mention that in the comments, because I think the film is very important. I think it's a wonderful, beautiful film that I think should be seen. So I would highly recommend you watching it, and I hope that you get a chance to do it. So, and on that, I want to thank you for joining me for this inaugural episode of the Criterion Chronicle, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure that you like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And coming up next on the Criterion Chronicle, I will be covering one of the greatest films of all time and Criterion Spine number 2, Akira Kurosawa's epic masterpiece, Seven Samurai. So if you want to continue on this journey with me through the Criterion Collection, then make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you never miss an episode. Take care, and I hope to see you next time.